So a comment that has been made on a number of my posts by people is this idea that they miss the early days of MTV. They miss that era, which I do as well. And this has made me ask the question, well, what is it that we really miss? Because we live in a time period where we can pretty much pull up any music video for any band that we want for free. So, what is it that we really miss? And this actually started me on a journey to try to answer that question, which has involved going through 45 years worth of weekly top 40, Billboard top 40 data. And actually, there's something kind of interesting that I'd like to share with you.
Warning, the following post may cause you to contemplate stuff. If you feel you are uncertain as to your capacity to contemplate stuff, please consult a physician, your spouse, or your horoscope before continuing. So we can see that there's a period in the 1980s where you would have the maximum diversity of top-level genres represented within the Billboard Weekly Top 40. Case in point, we can take a look at the week of February 23rd, 1985, and all 5 of these bands would have been in the Billboard Top 40 playlist that week. Now, sometime around the latter half of the 1980s, we would actually start to see a trend which would continue for the following 30 years, where the number of distinct top-level genres represented within the Billboard Weekly Top 40 would actually begin to shrink. And we find ourselves now where there's really 2 dominant genres being represented. So it's not just about the representation of the genre, but also the ratio of that representation compared to other genres. So for example, if we look at the 1980s, we see that the 3 dominant genres were rock, pop, R&B, soul, followed closely by new wave and then hip hop. Now, as we go into the 1990s, you see the growth of hip hop, but you really see the explosion of R&B and soul. I mean, looking back, that was the decade Mariah Carey came on the scene. You had several hits from Luther Vandross, Babyface and his production company, Jodeci, Tony, Boyz II Men, Blackstreet, etc. There was just a lot of growth within R&B, while at the same time, though, we were beginning to see fewer total genres being represented within the top 40. Now, between the years of 2000 and 2020, we continue to see the growth in hip-hop as well as growth in pop, while we continue to lose more and more genres from the top 40. We also see a massive reduction in rock, as well as a reduction in R&B and soul, which brings us now to the first 18 months or so of the 2020s, where pretty much hip-hop is king, followed by a smaller slice for pop, and then Latin-influenced sounds, whether that's Latin trap or reggaeton as the subgenres. So now this next statement may trigger some people, and I really don't mean to do that, because at this point, I'm just speaking to the data. But in addition to seeing fewer representation of genres within the top 40, I think we're also seeing less representation of personality and creative perspective. And here's what I mean. So in looking at the top 40 now, we can see that 45% of the singles released are actually collaborations, whether it's between artists or collaborations between producers. Now, to put this in perspective, in 70s, 80s, maybe the first part of the 90s, what we would see is 5% or fewer of the songs on the top 40 would actually be collaborations. Additionally, we're seeing that 22% of the artists that are on the top 40 as a solo release are also on the top 40 as part of a collaboration. And finally, we can see that about 12% of the artists have multiple singles on the top 40. So what does all this mean? Well, essentially the days of the top 40 representing diversity in terms of genres or creative perspective are really long gone. I mean, what we see now is the repackaging of the same artists, either on multiple singles or on multiple collaborations. All right, so now let's go back to this slide right here, because if you remember, there's a period of time in the 80s where we saw a bump in the diversity of genres represented within the Billboard Top 40. What was going on during this time period? It could be a number of things, but if you think about it, that's actually when MTV was in their early days, within their heydays of representing music. So why do I think MTV could have had an impact back then? Well, when you think about radio, if a song comes on that you don't want to hear, what do? Well, you channel surf. You hop around until you find a song that you do want to hear. Well, at that point in time, there, one, really wasn't another music video channel for you to just jump to. And two, to borrow a more current term, FOMO, fear of missing out. Well, there was a fear of missing out in those early days of MTV, which was you didn't want to run the risk that the follow-on video would have been for a band that you really did want to see. So as a result, you would have been exposed to and maybe even have become a fan of artists and songs that you really never would have sought out on your own. Now check this out. From the latter part of the 1980s to the first part of the 1990s, both MTV and VH1 would move away from music video programming. And that's also when we happened to start seeing the reduction in genres being represented within the Billboard Top 40. Which brings us to today. Through services such as YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, etc., we operate within a full self-serve model. We can skip past content that we don't want to hear or see, or filter out content we don't want to receive.
So as I wrap up, I'd like to share a thought with you. Today, we listen to music almost in a completely singular experience where we only select the artists and the songs that we're familiar with or that we like at the cost of filtering out anything that we don't know, we're not comfortable with, or we just don't like. And for all intents and purposes, that's not an unreasonable request. But once upon a time, there was a generation where we watched music as a community. Some of us were metalheads, others were into R&B, maybe pop, maybe some people were into new wave, but we all had that collective experience where we watched that same single stream of music videos. And maybe as a result of it, we developed some common ground. We developed the ability to relate to each other regardless of our preferred musical tastes. And is it possible that over the years that continued to give us the skill set to develop empathy and to relate to others regardless of differences in opinion? So now whenever I hear somebody talk about how they miss that MTV experience, what I'm left wondering is it that you miss the music, or do you really just miss that shared collective experience where we would all be introduced to music that maybe we wouldn't have selected if it was up to our own accord? And maybe to some extent, what we really do need nowadays is a little bit more of an MTV experience for everybody.